All right, the last section here on evolution has to deal with actual process of speciation. Just because we have organisms changing over time, in other words, undergoing evolution, does not always mean that we get speciation. So we do need to kind of talk about, all right, how does this process actually occur? So factors like natural selection that happens on individuals and genetic drift can change the relative frequencies of alleles in a population. But, like I said, this alone doesn't necessarily lead to the development of a new species. We have to have certain conditions met in order for the new species to actually start to emerge. And we also have to have this cumulative effect. In other words, it can't just be one trait that causes a new species. All right, so speciation is defined as the formation of a new species. And a species, with our kind of clunky definition here, is a population whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This one is kind of difficult to use for all organisms, but for right now, that's the one we're going to use. The big factor that we have to have in order for new species to form is we have to have isolation, specifically reproductive isolation. So if this occurs, the population can actually evolve into two separate species. And there's different ways that this reproductive isolation can happen. So if I have two populations and they don't reproduce with each other, that's where I can get the breaking apart of species. Now, we can have behavioral isolation. So in other words, how they behave and how they work can keep them apart. Geographic and temporal. So we're going to go through these here in a minute. But what you would see on kind of a timeline for all of these things actually prevent interbreeding. And so what you would see on kind of a timeline here is you've got this one population and all of a sudden you get divergence and you get the splitting, and that can lead to the creation of a new species. So let's go through these different types of isolation. So behavioral isolation, so they're capable of interbreeding, but because of certain behaviors that they develop, they don't. There's new courtship rituals, there's maybe other behaviors that keep them from not breeding with each other. This one is kind of difficult to actually have completely happen, but it does happen every so often. Probably a more common one on Earth is the geographic isolation. Two populations get separated by geographic barriers like rivers, mountains, bodies of water, whatever, and therefore they physically can't reach each other to interbreed. So because they can't, we get that splitting a lot sooner. Temporal isolation refers to when the two populations, for whatever reason, start reproducing at different times. So because they're going through their reproductive cycles at different times, they also can't breed with each other. So we'll take a look here at some examples of these, and this isn't in your notes, but just to give you kind of an example. Finches from South America, species A, arrived at the Galapagos Islands. Because of the founder effect, the allele frequencies of this population could have differed from those in the South American population. So we have some geographic, they can't get back to the mainland, and they can't, so they can only interbreed with each other. So over time, the populations on each island adapted to the local environments. Natural selection could have caused two distinct populations to evolve, species A and species B, each characterized by a new set of phenotypes. Now the other thing with the Galapagos is the birds can't get easily from island to island there because of other factors, the wind currents, the water currents, and also they have different sources of food. Look at their beaks are different, their colors are different, so they have evolved into two species. Now, over time, the populations on each island, because they adapted to local environments, they began to develop differences in courtship behaviors that led that led to differences in reproductive behaviors, further isolating each population. So if B goes back and is able to get back and intermingle with A, they're not going to be able to breed because their rituals are different. So birds that are different from each other have the highest fitness. The more specialized birds have less competition for food. Over time, species evolve in a way that increases the differences between them, and new species may evolve. So you get species C, species D, and even species E. They compete with each other, and the ones with the best traits actually go ahead and survive. All right, so we have one last worksheet. It's on the back side of your handout packet on speciation. So we're going to go through kind of the process that leads to speciation, and one row has been completed for you. So the first is the founders arrive, like those first birds that arrived from the mainland of South America on the Galapagos. So populations are separated by a geographic barrier and do not share a gene pool. That is geographic isolation. Populations evolve new traits in response to natural selection in their environment. That is changes in the gene pool. Populations reproduce only within their own group, leading to the development of a new species. That is reproductive isolation. And then species evolve in a way that reduces competition between them. That is ecological competition. So you can see the process of speciation actually brings together a lot of the things that we talk about during this course of biology. It involves genetics. It involves ecology. It involves the different life processes that we have going on. So it really ties together a lot of the centralized themes of our biology course here. All right. Do populations that are geographically isolated from each other share a gene pool? The answer is no. And why? Well, they're not able to contact or reproduce with each other, so they can't share the genes.